The wet canvas clung to Clara Ara Weiss's face like a second skin made of death. It was thick, soaked through, and it stank of things a person shouldn't have to smell in their last moments: horse sweat, river mud, and blood. With every ragged gasp she took, it pressed deeper, turning the simple act of breathing into a nightmare. Air became mud. Mercy became suffocation. She fought the urge to scream, but instinct is a traitor. A strangled cry clawed its way out of her throat as cold, gritty water seeped into her mouth, into her nostrils. Her body convulsed, yanking hard against the coarse rope that bit into her wrists, binding her to the iron hitching post behind her. The crowd gathered in the dusty square of Red Hollow didn't even flinch. Not a single soul stepped forward. Not one voice spoke up for her. Sheriff Amos Clean stood near the water trough, his thick arms folded over a chest that held no heart. His boots were planted wide, a man perfectly comfortable in his cruelty. His face was carved from stone. Only the slight rhythmic twitch of his jaw betrayed just how much he was enjoying this, watching her drown in broad daylight. Sunlight glinted off the cheap tin star pinned to his vest, but in that moment, it might as well have been a noose. "Where's the Apache boy, Clara Ara?" he asked. His voice was casual, like a man ordering a coffee at the general store. "Where's the little savage?" She tried to shake her head to deny him anything, but the weight of the soaked canvas was too much. It pulled her head down, forcing her to bow. All she could think was, "If I die here, no one will ever know the real reason why." She'd seen the brand stitched onto the corner of the cloth just before they forced it over her face. Braddock Cattle Co., the same name as the men who'd come to her door 3 nights ago. They'd come with torches that spat embers into the night sky and dogs that snarled and strained at their leashes. They were looking for a child, a boy. A child nobody in this town cared about because his skin wasn't the right color. She'd hidden him. She'd hidden Taji in her root cellar, down in the cool, dark earth. She'd fed him her last few potatoes, boiled and soft. She'd wrapped the gash on his forehead with one of her father's old clean handkerchiefs. She'd even sung him lullabies in German, the language of her childhood, while the mob pounded at her door, their shouts shaking the very foundations of her home. Now they called her a kidnapper, a witch, a traitor to her own kind. Her lungs began to spasm, desperate for air they couldn't have. Black spots swirled and danced behind her eyes, a frantic ballet of impending darkness. The canvas sealed tighter, a final, suffocating kiss. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Someone in the crowd jeered. And then, gunfire. One shot, loud, close, cracking through the afternoon heat and echoing off the wooden storefronts like the wrath of God. The weight on her head vanished. Clara Ara gasped, sucking in air so hard it burned its way down her throat. The world came rushing back in a chaotic blur of sound and motion. People were screaming. Boots were scrambling on the hard-packed dirt. The canvas was ripped from her face and flung aside. Her wrists were still bound, the rope digging deep into her raw skin. She slumped forward, wheezing, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. A hand gripped her shoulder. It was firm, rough, alive. "You're not dying today," a voice said. It was deep, clipped, with an accent she didn't recognize. She looked up through water-blurred eyes. He stood tall, a silhouette against the merciless sun. His skin was the color of sun-baked clay, his long hair braided tight and streaked with ash and eagle feathers. He wore a faded and torn Union cavalry coat over beaded buckskin, a strange mix of 2 worlds. The rifle in his other hand was still smoking. The crowd just stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. They looked at him as if he'd just ridden in from hell itself. It was Kohana, the Apache ghost of Red Hollow, the one mothers warned their sons about in hushed, frightened whispers. "Step away, Red! Sheriff Clean snarled, his hand already fumbling for the revolver on his hip. Kohana's voice was unnervingly calm. You want a war, Sheriff? Cleany's lip curled into a sneer. You and what, Army? Kohana didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. You talk too much. And then everything exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides, cracking and popping through the square. Horses screamed, their terror a piercing sound above the chaos. Thick, acrid smoke rolled from the porch of the general store, obscuring the sun. Clara Ara felt strong arms wrap around her waist. She was lifted off her knees, her legs trailing uselessly behind her, the rope still biting into her wrists. She heard Kohana bark a sharp command in Apache. A bullet hit the hitching post right where her head had been moments before, spraying splinters of wood into her hair. They ducked into the narrow, dark alley beside the barber shop, the sounds of the gunfight echoing around them. Kohana cut her bindings in a single, fluid stroke with a knife so sharp it seemed to hum in the air. She collapsed onto the dirt, her hands throbbing, her skin raw and screaming. Her dress was soaked and torn, clinging to her like a shroud. I didn't tell them anything, she croaked, coughing up dirty water. I know. He glanced back down the alley, his eyes sharp and focused. Can you run? Her voice broke. Her entire body trembled with shock and exhaustion. He looked her dead in the eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. If you can breathe, you can run. Now, move. They tore through the back alleys of Red Hollow, a desperate, frantic flight. Her worn boots slipped on loose gravel and patches of something dark and wet she refused to believe was blood. The sky was burning a fierce orange over the distant mesa tops, and the ever-present dust clung to every cut, every scratch, every ragged breath she took. Kohana led her behind the old abandoned freight station and toward the southern ridge, where the jagged outskirts of the town bled into the unforgiving desert. By the time they reached the edge of the arroyo, Clara Ara's legs finally gave out. She dropped behind a large cactus, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists. Kohana crouched beside her, his gaze fixed on the trail below, watching it with the intensity of a hawk scanning for mice. You should have let them kill me, she whispered, the words tasting like defeat. It would have been easier. You fed my nephew, he said, his voice flat, his eyes never leaving the trail. That's more than this town has ever done for one of my people. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting iron. How do you know about Taji? I've been tracking him. I heard about the raid on your house. Then I heard about you. He finally turned to look at her and his expression was grim. And now, I've got 2 people to save instead of 1. She wanted to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. Instead, she curled into herself and whispered a prayer in German. It was a half-remembered thing, something her father would murmur to her as a child, tucking her in after a bad storm. A sudden gust of wind howled through the canyon, flinging sand that stung like salt in her open wounds. Kohana stood up, a tall, imposing figure scanning the horizon. They'll come, he said, his voice low and certain. Braddock won't stop. He paused, then looked down at her, his eyes seeming to see right through her. Not with what your father found. Clara Ara blinked, confused. What do you know about my father? Kohana finally looked at her. Really looked at her. And what he said next made her blood run cold. Enough to know he didn't fall. And he didn't die by accident. Her stomach dropped, a sickening lurch of fear and dawning horror. He held out his hand to her. It wasn't gentle, not cruel, just steady, a lifeline. You said you can't run. Fine. Then walk. She took it. Her fingers closed around his and he pulled her to her feet. They disappeared into the deep shadows of the arroyo, the town of Red Hollow a burning smudge in the distance behind them. It was behind them, but it wasn't nearly far enough. The sun dipped lower behind the craggy teeth of the southern ridge as Clara Ara followed Kohana down a dry wash, a deep scar carved into the earth by centuries of vanished water. Her legs screamed with every step, her palms throbbed with the raw, angry rope burns, and her breath came in short, broken sobs. But she kept moving. She moved because he did, because stopping meant being found, and being found meant a death far worse than the one she'd just escaped. Every now and then he'd glance over his shoulder, not to check if she was still there, but to make sure she hadn't given up on herself. They'd been walking for what felt like an eternity, well over an hour since they'd fled the chaos of Red Hollow. The sounds of the town, the gunfire, the shouting, the baying of dogs, had long since faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert wind. Still, Clara Ara felt them pressing in behind her like a pack of relentless ghosts. The arroyo deepened, the shadows creeping up the high rock walls like black ink bleeding onto a page. When they finally reached a sharp bend in the wash, shielded by a thicket of thorn brush and a towering sandstone formation, Kohana finally stopped. "We rest here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. 5 minutes. Clara Ara collapsed against the cool rock, sliding down until her back hit the dusty ground. She winced as her wrist brushed against the stone, the skin torn and the burn an angry, swollen purple. Kohana knelt by a nearby mesquite bush, pulled a small leather pouch from his saddlebag, and produced a wad of a greenish, pungent paste wrapped in a piece of rawhide. Without a word, he reached for her arm. She flinched away instinctively. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice even and steady. "This will help the swelling." Clara Ara hesitated for a moment, then slowly, cautiously, held out her arm. He smeared the cool, soothing balm along the torn, broken flesh with the steady, practiced hands of someone who had tended to 1,000 wounds. She bit her lip hard to keep from crying out, but the relief was immediate. "You're good at this," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't answer. He just continued his work, his focus absolute. "You said Taji is your nephew," she said, breaking the silence. "He is." She nodded, watching the wind tease the feathers in his long braids. "I didn't take him, you know. I didn't lure him to my house. I found him near my well, half-conscious, bleeding. They were chasing him like an animal." "I know." The simple words, spoken with such certainty, made her throat tighten. "How could you know?" He finally looked up from her wrist, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Taji wouldn't run to just anyone." The unspoken trust in his words was a small, fragile comfort in the midst of her terror. "I hid him under my house, in the cellar. I gave him some soup, and I bandaged his head. He reminded me of my father when I was a little girl, scared, but trying so hard to be brave." Kohana looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "My papa was Bavarian," she explained, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "He didn't believe in much, not God or governments, but he believed that water was life. He used to say, 'The one who controls the water controls the future.'" Kohana's eyes darkened, the brief flicker of warmth gone. "He wasn't wrong." Clara Ara leaned her head back against the rock, the bone-deep exhaustion pulling her down like a powerful tide. "He was a land surveyor. Knew these hills better than anyone. 2 years ago they said he fell off a ridge while he was out mapping. But his horse came back with no scratches, his saddle was perfectly intact, and I found dried blood on the stirrups." Kohana's jaw clenched, the muscle jumping in his cheek. "He didn't fall." Clara Ara sat up straight, her own pain forgotten. "You said that before. In the alley. What do you know? What aren't you telling me?" Kohana looked out toward the fading sky, the last vestiges of daylight bleeding away. "Silas Braddock owns more than just cattle. He owns the sheriff. He owns half the men in the land office, and he damn sure owns the water board. Your father was planning to file a federal claim on a new survey. I heard about it from a man who used to work at the county recorder's office. A week after your father talked about that claim, he was dead. Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. You think he was murdered? For a land claim? I don't think, he said, his voice flat and hard. I know. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry as dust. What? What was he trying to claim? Kohana picked up a handful of the red desert dust and let it sift through his fingers like grains of thyme. There's water under this basin, deep, cold water, enough to feed every ranch and every village from here to the Alamo, but it's all on federal land, which means no one can touch it, unless someone files on it with a new, verified survey. Clara Ara's mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. He was planning to do that. He told me it would change everything for this valley. It would have. Kohana stood up, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the deepening twilight. Braddock couldn't let that happen. He's been bleeding this land dry for years, controlling who gets to drink and who doesn't. And with your father gone, he thinks no one else can prove where that water runs. She looked up at him, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. But I remember. He showed me some of the maps. I helped him mark the landmarks. I know what he was working on. Kohana's eyes locked onto hers, and the look in them was chilling. Then you're worth more to him dead than alive. The silence between them thickened, heavy and suffocating. The desert grew darker, the air cooling rapidly. Finally, Clara Ara found her voice again. Why are you helping me? Kohana didn't answer immediately. He crouched by a small, natural fire pit, gathering dried grass into a bundle. Because you saved my blood, he said at last, his back to her. And because I know what they do to people like you. People who do the right thing when they think no one is watching. He lit a small fire with a piece of flint and steel, the sparks jumping into the air like restless, angry spirits. Clara Ara wrapped her arms around her knees, shivering, though not from the cold. Taji, she asked, her voice small. Do you think he's still alive? If Braddock needs leverage against me, or you, Kohana said, staring into the flames, he's keeping him close. But time is running thin. Clara Ara took a shaky breath. Then we need to move before sunrise. No, he corrected her. We need to plan. We can't just ride into town with guns blazing. That's what they expect. We need allies, and we need proof. Clara Ara looked up, her mind latching onto a sliver of hope. I know someone. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. My father's old friend, she explained. Ruben Montoya. He's a veteran, got a piece of land out near the old Spanish mission. If anyone in this cursed valley would believe me, it's him. Then we go there, at first light. She nodded, then paused. A thought had been nagging at her, a question she was almost afraid to ask. Kohana, why now? My father died 2 years ago. Taji was taken 3 nights ago. Why are you just showing up now? His expression shifted, becoming harder, heavier, etched with a pain he tried to hide. Because for the last 3 months I've been tracking ghosts and rumors, not realizing the truth was buried right under my nose. I thought Taji was dead. Gone. A beat of silence passed, thick with regret. And because I saw what they did to you in that square today, and I saw what they will do to him if we don't stop it. A sharp gust of wind howled through the canyon, scattering the fire's smoke and making the flames dance wildly. He looked out into the vast, empty night again, as if he were expecting to see something, or someone out there in the darkness. Clara Ara broke the tense silence. So, where do we go from here? Kohana turned to her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, his voice like stone scraped clean of all emotion. If your father found water under this desert, then Silas Braddock buried more than just a man. and in the profound quiet that followed, the wind carried a sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of horses, far off, but growing steadily closer. They weren't safe yet, not even close, and dawn was still a very long way off. The old adobe walls of Ruben Montoya's ranch house caught the first gray, watery light of morning like ancient bones rising from the dust. The wind whispered through the surrounding mesquite groves, carrying the familiar scents of horses, gun oil, and dry sage. Clara Ara stood at the edge of the clearing, her throat dry as a bone, her fingers twitching with the nervous urge to knock. Kohana waited beside her, perfectly calm and still, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. So far, nothing stirred. "He won't turn us in," Clara Ara said, more to convince herself than him. "He served with my father during the border skirmishes. Saved his life once, Papa always said." Kohana didn't answer. He just gave a short, single nod. Then he stepped back into the dense brush, disappearing as completely and silently as smoke. "You go alone," he told her, his voice a low whisper from the shadows. "If he trusts you, he'll help. If not, you'll know." Clara Ara swallowed hard against the lump of fear in her throat, squared her shoulders, and stepped up to the heavy wooden door. She knocked 3 times, a sharp, deliberate rhythm. Then once more, for emphasis. There was a long pause from within, a silence that stretched her nerves taut. Then she heard the sound of a heavy bolt sliding free. The door creaked open just a hand's width. The first thing she saw was the dark, round muzzle of a shotgun. Then came a weathered face, dark eyes squinting beneath a tangled mess of gray-black hair. "Clara Ara." Ruben Montoya's voice was like gravel soaked in cheap whiskey. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what in the hell happened to you?" She exhaled a long, shuddering breath of relief. "I need help, Ruben, and not the kind that comes with a priest." He stepped aside without another word. "Inside, now." Ruben's ranch house was a time capsule of old wars and Catholic guilt. A heavy wooden crucifix hung above the stone fireplace. A half-loaded rifle rested on the mantel, ready for use. The furniture was all hand-carved, the rugs were Navajo woven, and the coffee he had brewing on the stove smelled like salvation. He poured her a steaming tin cup without asking, and sat across from her at the small kitchen table, his elbows resting on his knees. His sharp eyes scanned her wounds, her torn and filthy dress, the defiant fire that was still simmering behind her eyes. "You look like hell, Nina. They almost killed me in the square yesterday." "I heard something about that," he grumbled. "Heard the sheriff was calling you a kidnapper." Clara Ara nodded, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "He's lying. It's all Braddock's doing. Every last bit of it." Ruben's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "That son of a bitch has had this valley by the throat for far too long." She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Ruben, my father. He didn't die in a fall. They murdered him. He found something. Something Braddock wanted buried for good." "Water," he guessed, his voice flat. Her eyes widened in shock. How did you know?" Ruben stood up, walked to an old wooden drawer, and pulled out a folded sheet of tracing paper. "He came to me 2 nights before he died. Said he'd found a new spring out near the federal boundary line. Wanted to talk about filing a claim. Said it could change everything for the small ranchers, for everyone. But then he vanished." Clara Ara reached for the paper, her hands trembling. It was a rough sketch of the very same area her father had shown her. "Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you tell anyone?" Ruben's voice dropped, the gruffness replaced by a weary bitterness. "Because a week after he disappeared, my barn burned to the ground. 2 of my best hands were shot trying to stop it. The sheriff made no arrests. Asked no questions." He looked her straight in the eye. So, you stayed quiet, she whispered. I stayed alive, he corrected her. Just then, the front door creaked open behind them. Kohana stepped inside, his rifle slung low, his eyes sweeping the room in a single practiced motion. Reuben flinched, his hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked into his belt. Friend of yours? He asked Clara Ara, his voice tight. He saved my life. Reuben gave a slow, measured nod. Apache, he stated, not a question. Chiricahua. You got a problem with that? Kohana asked, his voice a low growl. Reuben snorted, a dry, humorless sound. I got a problem with cowards and liars, not warriors. They stared at each other for a long, tense beat. Then something unspoken, some kind of mutual recognition, passed between the two men. They were both survivors of wars most people had already forgotten. Reuben finally broke the silence, gesturing toward a door leading to a back room. There's someone else you should talk to. She saw what happened the night the boy disappeared. Clara Ara blinked. Who? Ruthie. Ruthie Delgado. Ruthie stood near the back window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if holding herself together. She was young, maybe 20, but her dark eyes held the heavy weight of someone twice her age. Her long black hair was braided tightly, and a faded apron was tied at her waist. When she saw Clara Ara, her face lit up with a mixture of relief and fear. Senora Weiss, I thought they killed you. Almost, Clara Ara said softly, but not yet. Ruthie's gaze flicked nervously to Kohana, then back to Clara Ara. You're looking for the boy, aren't you? The one you hid. Clara Ara nodded. You saw him? I was there, she whispered. I was in your kitchen when he came in through the back door. He was covered in blood, shaking so bad I thought he was going to collapse right there on the floor. Did anyone else see him? No, but I heard voices outside. Sheriff Clean and 3 other men. They were shouting his name. Then they started throwing rocks at the house. I helped you get him into the cellar. Clara Ara stepped closer, a sudden thought occurring to her. You wrote it down, didn't you? You always keep a diary. You write everything down. Ruthie hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. Yes, but I didn't know what to do with it. I was so afraid. Do you still have it? Kohana spoke for the first time since entering the house, his voice making the young woman jump. Ruthie nodded and hurried to a corner of the room. She pried up a loose floorboard and fetched a small, leather-bound journal. She handed it to Clara Ara, who flipped through the pages filled with careful, neat Spanish script. She stopped at an entry dated 3 nights prior. Taji came in bleeding. The sheriff was outside. The dogs were barking. Miss Clara Ara told me not to be afraid. She sang him to sleep while I held the candle. I think she knew then. I think she knew she was already in danger. Clara Ara's throat tightened. Will you testify? Kohana asked Ruthie directly. The girl paled, her face ashen. If they find out I helped... They already suspect, Reuben cut in, his voice grim. But you won't be alone this time. Kohana turned to Clara Ara. We have a witness. We have a motive. We have your father's notes. It's enough to go to the doctor. Clara Ara blinked. Dr. Llewellyn? You said he was close to my father. Yes, Kohana agreed. But he also signed the death certificate. That makes him either a liar working for Braddock or a coward who knows too much. Clara Ara nodded reluctantly. He lives east of the arroyo, out near the cemetery. Then we go tonight. Reuben stood up, already loading fresh shells into a heavy revolver. You'll need more than just maps. Braddock has eyes and ears everywhere. Kohana met his gaze, a glint of steel in his eyes. Then we move like ghosts. Night fell over the small ranch, folding the vast desert into deep, impenetrable shadow. Clara Ara stood on the porch beside Ruthie. Why did you help him? she asked quietly. You could have just turned him away. He was just a boy, Ruthie said simply. And he was afraid. Clara Ara swallowed the lump in her throat. Behind her, Kahana checked his rifle one last time. Reuben cinched the saddle on his old, sturdy mule. The night was still, but the wind tasted of dust and gunpowder. As they prepared to set out toward the eastern hills, Clara Ara looked back one last time at the young woman standing in the doorway. "Thank you, Ruthie," she said. The girl gave a small, brave smile. "Bring him home." The moon rose full and white over Red Hollow, and somewhere beneath its cold, watchful gaze, a boy waited. They weren't just chasing a kidnapper anymore. They were hunting the map that was locked inside Clara Ara's head. The trail to Red Gorge twisted like a jagged scar across the face of the desert, winding its way through thorny scrub brush and sun-bleached rock. By the time Clara Ara, Kohana, and Reuben reached the edge of the canyon, the sun was cresting high overhead, a merciless ball of fire that turned the sand to shimmering glass and the air to a furnace. Every single hoof step stirred up the fine red dust that gave the gorge its name, and every gust of wind seemed determined to carry it back into their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Clara Ara pulled her bandana higher across her face and squinted at the rust-colored cliffs that loomed ahead. "He died out here," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness. "They said it was a fall. But there's no place to fall from. Just hard ground and even harder stories." Reuben grunted from his mule. "Falls don't leave bruises on a man's neck. I remember what I saw when they brought his body back to town." Kohana dismounted first, his boots crunching against the loose gravel as he walked toward a large cluster of boulders near the canyon mouth. He dropped to one knee, pressing his palm flat against the dirt, his eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that missed nothing. "Tracks," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "Wagon. Heavy. No shoes on the horses. Means they didn't want to be heard." Clara moved closer, her gaze following his. She stared at the layered ridges and depressions in the dust, trying to decipher their meaning. How old? 3 days? Maybe 4. Reuben knelt beside them, his old knees cracking in protest. "That's when Braddock's men came through here last. Same time Taji disappeared." Kohana looked up, his gaze sweeping across the jagged rock wall that rose above them like the teeth of some great, dead beast. "There's a cave system behind those rocks. Old ones. If your father found the source of the water, that's where he would have gone to map it." Clara Ara nodded slowly, a distant memory surfacing. "We came here once when I was a child. He told me this place was older than the stars. He said you could hear the canyon breathe if you just stayed quiet enough." Reuben gave her a sharp look. "You think he hid something in there?" "I think he knew he didn't have much time," she replied. "If I knew my father, and I did, he left a trail only I would understand." They climbed the steep, rocky slope cautiously, ducking behind sagebrush and boulders, their ears alert to every sound. The silence of the gorge was eerie, unnatural. It was too still, too quiet for a place that should have been alive with the sound of wind and birds. Near the base of the cliff, Kohana spotted it. A single rock, shaped like a perfect arrowhead, jutting out from the wall. Behind it, almost completely hidden, was a narrow crevice, just wide enough for a grown man to slip through. He turned to Clara Ara. "You said he brought you here with him?" She nodded. "Then you go first." Inside, the air was instantly cool and damp, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. Their footsteps echoed off the stone walls like furtive whispers. Clara Ara struck a match, and the small flame flared to life, casting dancing shadows around them. She held it high, revealing a narrow, uneven tunnel that sloped downward into impenetrable darkness. Old surveyors' chalk marks still clung to the walls, faint and barely visible after 2 long years. "There," she murmured, pointing. "Papa always marked left turns with double slashes. Right turns got circles." They followed the cryptic signs deeper and deeper into the earth, the small match flame flickering with each breath, threatening to plunge them into absolute blackness. Reuben grumbled behind them, muttering about the smell of wet stone and the presence of ghosts. But Clara kept moving, driven by a desperate hope. Finally, the tunnel widened into a small, dry cavern, and in the center, a sight that made her heart leap into her throat. A stack of old wooden crates, a rusted tin lantern, and a canvas satchel with a faded embroidered W stitched into the side. Clara rushed forward, her breath catching. She knelt in the dust and fumbled with the straps of the satchel. Inside, she found exactly what she was looking for: survey maps, rolled tight and tied with string, a small pocket compass, a journal bound in worn leather, and a letter, folded carefully, addressed in her father's familiar, steady handwriting. "Clara, if you are reading this, then I am already gone." Her hands trembled so much she could barely unfold the paper. "The water is real, deeper and more vast than they ever could have imagined. I have found the aquifer. I marked the main spring beneath Mesa de las Estrellas, where we used to go to watch the stars. The claim must be filed with the federal office in Santa Fe, but I know I will not make it there. Braddock knows. I believe someone I trusted betrayed me, maybe more than one. Don't trust anyone unless they have bled for you. You were always the strong one. Keep going." Her breath caught in a ragged sob. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the precious words. Reuben put a heavy, comforting hand on her shoulder. "He didn't die for nothing, Mia." She stood up slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, but we need more than just a letter. We need someone to say this out loud, to make it real." Kohana stepped forward, taking one of the maps and holding it up to the flickering light of a fresh match. "This marks Braddock's current grazing land. But here," he pointed to a small, precise X on a hilltop ridge just beyond the boundary. "That's federal land. If the spring lies there, it changes everything." Clara carefully folded the letter and slipped it into the bodice of her dress, close to her heart. "Then we need to prove it. And we need to get to Dr. Llewellyn before they do." Suddenly, the sharp, deafening report of a rifle shot echoed from the cave entrance. "Down!" Kohana shouted, shoving her behind the stack of crates. A bullet cracked into the stone wall just above Reuben's head, sending a shower of sharp rock shards raining down on them. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. Kohana rolled to the entrance, raised his rifle, and fired 2 quick, calculated shots out into the blinding sunlight. A man's scream followed. Then, a tense, terrifying silence. More gunshots erupted from above, from the rim of the canyon. Dust and pebbles poured into the cave as the outer wall shuddered from the impact of multiple bullets. Someone had thrown dynamite. The explosion was deafening. "We're pinned!" Reuben growled, his face grim. "They're trying to collapse the damn cave on top of us." Kohana's eyes were narrow, calculating slits. "There's only one way out now." Clara clutched the precious satchel to her chest. "If we lose these maps, get ready to move." He cut her off. They waited for the next blast. When it came, it shook the very foundations of the cave, but it didn't collapse it. As the thick clouds of dust swirled, choking the air, Kohana leaped from their cover and returned fire. Reuben followed, his revolver blasting. Clara ran behind them, clutching her father's journal like a lifeline. They fought their way back through the narrow tunnel, slipping and sliding in the loose gravel and debris. By the time they burst back out into the harsh daylight, 2 of Braddock's men were down, and a third had fled on horseback, a dark shape disappearing into the heat haze. But the damage was done. Their tracks were exposed. Their presence was known. "They'll know we were here," Reuben panted, wiping a trickle of blood from a cut on his temple. "Let them," Kohana said, his voice cold and hard. "We've got what we came for." Clara Ara looked down at the satchel in her hands. We have the proof. Now we just need someone willing to say that it matters. Kahana turned his gaze toward the open desert, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as the landscape itself. Then it's time we go and have a little talk with the good doctor. As they rode hard toward the eastern ridge, where Dr. Llewellyn's house sat like a lonely ghost on the horizon, Clara Ara's thoughts spiraled. The journal, the survey maps, the fight in the cave, and her father's chilling warning. Don't trust anyone who hasn't bled for you. She looked at Kahana, riding ahead with a silent, deadly resolve. Then to Reuben, wincing with every jarring bounce in the saddle. They had both bled for her today. They had earned her trust. But what about the doctor? What about the man who had signed her father's life away? She wasn't so sure about him. The gorge didn't kill her father, and she had a sinking feeling she was about to find out who did. The house on the ridge stood like it was waiting for something, or someone, waiting to finally be called to account for its secrets. Dr. Horace Llewellyn's home had once been a respectable place, whitewashed and clean, with roses that curled and climbed over the porch railings and a polished brass bell at the gate. But that was a long time ago. Now the paint peeled like sunburned skin. The roses were just a tangle of dry, dead thorns, and the bell hung silent, its clapper tied with a scrap of dirty cloth. Nothing about the place felt like healing or medicine. It felt like decay. Clara Ara sat motionless in her saddle, her eyes fixed on the front door. He signed the certificate, she said, mostly to herself, the words a bitter taste in her mouth. He wrote, "Accidental fall" in neat black ink. Reuben checked the cylinder of his pistol, spinning it with a practiced thumb. Sometimes ink's a whole lot cheaper than the truth. Kahana dismounted without a word. He walked straight to the door, his step sure and steady. He knocked 3 times, firm, sharp, insistent, then stepped back, his hand resting lightly on the stock of his rifle. There was no response. "Dr. Llewellyn!" Clara Ara called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's Clara Ara Weiss. We need to talk to you." Silence. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, the door creaked open just an inch. The man peering out from the darkness within looked a decade older than Clara Ara remembered. His once slick dark hair was now shot through with gray at the temples, and his eyes had the cautious, fearful twitch of a man who'd spent too long listening for footsteps in the dark. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "Not after what happened to you in town." "We didn't come for tea, Doctor," Clara Ara replied, her own voice hard as steel. "We came for the truth." Llewellyn's frightened gaze flicked from Clara Ara to the imposing figure of Kahana, then to Reuben, his jaw tightening with a fear that was almost palpable. Then, with a long, resigned sigh, he opened the door wider. "Inside! Quickly!" The inside of the house smelled of stale ink and morphine. Bottles of all shapes and sizes lined the shelves, and medical journals were stacked on every available surface like crumbling dusty bones. A broken chair leaned in one corner, the fabric of its seat stained with something dark that looked an awful lot like dried blood. Llewellyn motioned them toward the small sitting room. "Keep your voices down," he hissed. "I'm being watched." "You were always being watched," Reuben muttered under his breath. The doctor turned his attention back to Clara Ara. "You're lucky to be alive." "No thanks to you," she shot back. He flinched as if she'd struck him. "You think I wanted this? You think I asked for any of it? I think you signed my father's death away like it was just another form on your desk." Llewellyn sat down hard in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands, a man at the end of his rope. "I was scared, Clara Ara. Braddock came to me the day before the accident. He told me to stay quiet, that your father had crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed." He didn't ask me. He ordered me. And you just obeyed? She asked, her voice dripping with contempt. He looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, shining with guilt. They threatened my son. Jonah. They said if I didn't play along, they'd make him disappear. What would you have done? Kohana stepped forward, his presence filling the small, cluttered room. I'd have fought. You're not a father, Llewellyn cried. I've bled for children who weren't my own, Kohana growled, his voice a low threat. That counts for more. Clara Ara pulled her father's letter from her satchel and placed it firmly on the table between them. He trusted you. You were his friend. Llewellyn stared at the familiar handwriting, visibly shaken. He gave that to you? No, Clara Ara said coldly. He left it in a cave where he knew you, and men like you would never find it. Reuben dropped the survey maps beside the letter with a heavy thud. We have proof. We have the dates, the coordinates, a spring under federal land. And a motive, Kohana added. And a witness to the night of the raid. A girl who saw them chasing the boy. Llewellyn's hands trembled as he picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the detailed drawings. This is enough. This could bring the U.S. Marshals. Clara Ara leaned in, her eyes boring into his. Then say it. Say it on the record. Admit what really happened. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as if expecting Braddock's men to burst through the door at any moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed. Eric didn't fall. He was struck. In the back of the head. One of Braddock's men delivered the body to me, told me what to write on the certificate, and told me to sign. I told myself I was protecting my son, but you buried a good man, she finished for him, her voice breaking. Tears welled in the doctor's eyes, finally spilling over and tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. He came to me the week before, said he'd found something that could change this whole valley. Said he needed my help getting it notarized before he filed the claim in Santa Fe. What did you say? Reuben asked, his hand resting on his pistol. I told him I'd think about it. The doctor's voice dropped even lower, thick with shame. And then I told Braddock. Clara Ara stepped back as if she'd been slapped. You told him? I didn't know what he'd do, Llewellyn cried, his voice cracking. I swear I thought it would just scare your father off. I didn't think they'd... But they did, Kohana cut in, his voice like ice. And they're still doing it. That boy, my nephew, is still missing. The room went quiet, the only sound the doctor's ragged breathing. Llewellyn stood up, his body shaking. I have a telegraph line out back. I'll wire the U.S. Marshal's office in Socorro, but it might take time. Braddock has friends in high places. He'll know I've flipped the second that wire is sent. Reuben nodded grimly. Then we get moving. To where? Clara Ara asked. The boy, Kohana answered instantly. He's leverage. Braddock won't risk losing him, not now. He'll keep him close. Reuben's eyes narrowed in thought. Then he's on Braddock's land. The main cattle operations run out of his south range. Big stone house. Cellars. Uses them for storing barrels of salted meat. Clara Ara's breath hitched. A cellar. Just like hers. Taji could be there. Llewellyn moved to a drawer and pulled out a heavy revolver wrapped in an oily cloth. I can't fight with you, but I won't let them silence me again. He handed the gun to Clara Ara. She stared at it for a moment, then took it, the cold, heavy steel a grim reality in her hand. God help us all, the doctor muttered. Kohana moved to the window, peering out through the dirty glass. If we move at nightfall, we'll have one chance at this. No backup, just grit. Clara Ara looked at the weapon in her hand, her fingers curling around the grip, steady now with a cold, hard purpose. He saved my life, she said, her voice clear and strong. Now it's my turn. Outside, the wind had shifted. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, thick and gray. A storm was coming, but the real storm, the one of blood and vengeance, was already here. Mesa de las Estrellas. He taught me to dream there, she thought. Now I have to go dig in the dirt. Night fell heavy and black over the southern range. The wind howled low across the plains, brushing through the dry grass and rattling the barbed wire fences as if the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there in that oppressive darkness was a boy, Taji, and Clara Ara Weiss was going to bring him home, even if it cost her every last piece of herself. From their position on the ridge above Braddock's ranch, the main house glowed with a faint yellow light that seeped through its curtained windows. Below, in the yard, silhouettes moved near the stables, shadows with rifles slung over their shoulders and cigars that glowed like angry orange eyes in the dark. Kohana lay prone beside Clara Ara, his long rifle balanced steady on a flat rock, his eye pressed to the sight. "That's 4 guards on the front," he said, his voice a low whisper that was nearly carried away by the wind. "Maybe 2 more inside." Reuben crouched behind them, methodically checking the cylinder of his Colt. "The bunkhouse is empty. Looks like Braddock gave the hired hands the night off. Probably wanted fewer mouths talking about whatever he's got planned." Clara Ara studied the imposing stone house. 2 stories, a Spanish tile roof, and a pair of heavy cellar doors at the rear of the building. She could just make out the faint, flickering light of a lantern behind one of the small, ground-level side windows. Her breath caught in her throat. "That window," she whispered. "It leads to the root cellar. My father showed me once. He said the floor in there stayed cool even in the heat of July." "That's where they'll be keeping him," Kohana said with certainty. "Deep, dark, and locked." Reuben nodded toward the north pasture, a dark expanse of land dotted with cattle. "I can circle around, draw the guards over to the stable, fire a shot or 2. Make them think I'm just some drunk or a stupid rustler." Kohana looked at Clara Ara, his eyes dark and serious in the moonlight. "We take the cellar while they're chasing him. You go in, you find the boy." Clara Ara nodded, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "No second chances," Kohana said, his voice grim. "Once this starts, it's either fire or silence. There's nothing in between." She gripped the pistol Dr. Llewellyn had given her. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she was about to risk. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. Reuben's first shot cracked through the still night air like a clap of thunder on a dry bone. The reaction from the ranch house was immediate. Shouting erupted. Men's heavy boots stomped across wooden porch boards. Dogs began to bark furiously, and doors slammed open. Kohana was already moving, low and fast, a ghost slipping through the scrub brush. Clara Ara followed close behind, her heart hammering with each desperate step. They reached the cellar doors without being seen. They were locked just as they'd expected. Kohana slid a curved iron pick from his belt and expertly worked the heavy latch. A sharp click, a low creak. He nodded once and pulled the heavy door open. A rush of cool, moldy air swept over them. Clara Ara slipped inside, descending the narrow wooden stairs, the small lantern she carried casting long, dancing shadows across the room. It smelled of brine, old cheese, and decay. The flickering flame danced across barrels, sacks of feed, and rusted tools, until it finally landed on a small, huddled form curled up in the far corner. "Taji," she whispered. He stirred, blinking against the sudden light. A long, angry cut crossed his cheek, dried blood crusted at the edges. His wrist was chained to a thick iron pipe. His eyes widened in panic until he recognized her. "Clara Ara!" She ran to him. "Shh, it's okay. I've got you." The chain was bolted tight to the pipe, far too thick to break with their bare hands. She frantically searched the dusty shelves for a tool, anything. Nothing. Kohana dropped silently into the cellar moments later, his rifle slung over his back. Guards are distracted. We've got maybe 5 minutes. He's chained. Without a word, Kohana took his heavy hunting knife, jammed the tip of the blade into the edge of the bolt, and twisted with all his might. Once. Twice. Metal screamed in protest. Then, with a loud pop, the bolt snapped. Taji was free. "Can you walk?" Clara Ara asked, helping him to his feet. He nodded, his thin legs trembling beneath him. "We go," Kohana said. But the second they stepped out of the cellar and into the night air, the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from the porch of the main house. Reuben's decoy had drawn some of the men away, but not all of them. A bullet slammed into the dirt near Clara Ara's feet, sending a spray of dust into her face. "Go!" Kohana barked, pushing her forward. Clara Ara grabbed Taji's hand and ran, ducking behind the low stone wall of the well for cover. More shots rang out, the bullets whining past their heads. The guards were shouting, closing in. One of them suddenly fell, Reuben's rifle echoing from its position on the ridge, but there were still too many of them. Kohana dropped behind the well, returning fire with brutal, deadly precision. "We're not going to be able to outrun them." Clara Ara's eyes scanned the darkness, desperately searching for a way out. "The system," she said, a memory sparking. "There's a dry gully just past the cattle pens. It runs all the way to the old orchard." "We'll be sitting ducks in the open," Kohana said, firing another shot. "No," she insisted. "There's a culvert. Papa built it himself when they first dug this well. It leads half a mile under the brush. It's an escape route." He stared at her for a split second, then nodded. "Go. Now." They ran. Bullets whistled overhead, cutting through tree limbs and splintering fence posts around them. Taji stumbled once, but Clara Ara caught him, pulling him along. They reached the gully and slid down the steep, dusty bank just as another shot clipped the wooden gate right behind them. The entrance to the culvert was half hidden by a tangle of overgrown vines and busted fencing. Clara Ara dropped to her knees, tearing at the vines with her bare hands, and pulled the heavy iron grate loose. "In," she whispered urgently. Taji crawled in first, then Clara Ara. Kohana came last, sliding the heavy grate back into place, just as more bullets peppered the ground where they had just been. The tunnel was cold and narrow, barely high enough to crouch in. The air was thick with the smell of damp clay and rust. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, patient intervals, the sound like a ticking clock marking the seconds of their escape. For what felt like an eternity, they crawled in suffocating silence and darkness. Then the tunnel began to widen, the ceiling lifted, and they stepped out into the edge of the old orchard. It was overgrown and forgotten, but it was safe. Reuben was already there, waiting for them by a pile of broken wooden crates. "You're alive," he said, the relief in his voice thick and heavy. Kohana just nodded. "Barely." Clara Ara knelt beside Taji, inspecting the raw bruises on his wrists, brushing the matted hair from his face. "We've got you now," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Taji looked up at her, his own voice small and fragile. "They told me you were dead." Clara Ara managed a small, tired smile. "Not yet, kiddo." Kohana turned to Reuben. "They'll come after us by morning. We need to ride for Socorro. Bring the maps, the letter, the doctor, everything." Reuben held up a folded piece of paper. "Already wired the marshal. He'll meet us at the edge of town at dawn tomorrow. We just need to stay breathing until then." Clara Ara stood up, brushing the thick dust from her torn dress. She looked back toward the ranch, now just a distant, quiet collection of lights. But the silence didn't fool her for a second. Braddock would come for them. Not with threats this time, not with warnings. He'd come with fire and guns. She squared her shoulders, a new, hard resolve settling over her. "Then we bring the storm to him before he can bring it to us. Tonight we ran. Tomorrow we fight. Dawn bled slow and reluctant across the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and ash. The wind, which had been their ally in the night, now carried the scent of sagebrush and something darker. Smoke. Clara Ara tightened her grip on the reins as her horse crested the final ridge overlooking the dusty town of Socorro. Behind her, Kohana rode in a tense silence, his sharp eyes scanning every rooftop, every alleyway. Reuben flanked them, his rifle resting across the horn of his saddle. Taji rode with Ruthie, who had met them on the trail, in the supply wagon. He was bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big for him, watching the world pass by with the haunted, hollow eyes of a child who had seen far too much, far too young. Ahead of them lay their one chance, maybe their last one. The U.S. Marshal's office was a squat, unassuming adobe building tucked between the telegraph station and a shuttered feed store. A single, tattered flag flapped listlessly above the door. There were no soldiers, no waiting posse, just a heavy, expectant stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Reuben frowned. He was supposed to be here. Kohana dismounted and walked to the door. He pushed it open. It was empty. A chair was tipped over inside. Papers were scattered across the floor. The safe in the corner stood wide open. Clara Ara stepped inside slowly, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, dread-filled rhythm. This isn't right. She moved behind the desk. A crumpled telegram lay on the floor, partially hidden beneath a dusty boot print. Marshal McBride intercepted. Message compromised. Braddock likely warned. Proceed with caution. Her stomach turned to ice. He got to them first, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Kohana stepped back outside, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Then we make this public, right now. Reuben pointed toward the town square. That's where he'll be. Braddock doesn't hide, he postures. Clara Ara nodded, her fear hardening into cold anger. Then we're going to make him regret it. They rode into the heart of Socorro like a gathering storm front. The local townspeople were already gathering, drawn out of their homes by the rumors and the distant smell of smoke. Braddock stood near the old fountain in the center of the square, flanked by Sheriff Clean and 2 of his most ruthless hired guns. A false preacher, a man known for his fiery sermons about damnation, stood beside him, holding a Bible like it was a branding iron. And on a hastily constructed wooden platform, ropes hung like coiled vipers. 3 townspeople were tied there. Men Clara Ara recognized. Small ranchers, a schoolteacher. Their faces were bruised and bloodied, their mouths gagged with dirty rags. Braddock smiled a wide, cruel smile when he saw Clara Ara approach. Well, I'll be. The ghost of Red Hollow rides again. Kohana dropped from his saddle, his rifle held low, his demeanor calm and unreadable. Let them go, Braddock, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the square. Braddock just raised an eyebrow. Are you going to shoot me? Right here, in front of half the county? No, Clara Ara said, her own voice ringing out, clear and strong. You're going to bury yourself. She pulled her father's journal from her satchel and held it high for all to see. My name is Clara Ara Weiss, daughter of Eric Weiss, a federal surveyor who was murdered 2 years ago by the men standing behind Silas Braddock. He found water, real water, beneath Mesa de las Estrellas. He planned to file a claim to make that water public for all of us, and they killed him for it. A ripple of gasps and murmurs went through the crowd. Braddock laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You've got no proof, just desert dreams and second-hand lies from a traitor. I have more than that, Clara Ara shot back. She stepped aside as Dr. Llewellyn emerged from the wagon, his face pale but his expression steady and resolved. I signed the death certificate, the doctor said, his voice shaking but clear, and I falsified it. I did so under a direct threat from Silas Braddock. Eric Weiss was killed by a blunt force blow to the skull. It wasn't a fall. Braddock's smile finally faltered. Llewellyn continued, his voice growing stronger. They told me to lie, and I did, but not anymore. Clara Ara opened the journal and unrolled the precious map. This is a federal survey, authenticated by my father's own hand. It shows the coordinates, the depth, clear evidence of a massive aquifer lying under protected federal land. Braddock's men tried to destroy this evidence, but we made copies. One is already on its way to the territorial governor in Santa Fe. Braddock turned to the crowd, his face flushed with rage, his composure cracking. She's lying. She's a traitor. She kidnapped that Apache child. On cue, Taji stepped forward from behind the wagon. I wasn't kidnapped, he said, his small voice clear and cutting, slicing through the tense atmosphere. I was running from them. Kohana placed a firm, protective hand on the boy's shoulder. She protected him when no one else would, Kohana said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. She protected him when men with badges and blood on their hands tried to make him disappear. For a long moment, the crowd held its breath. Then a man shouted from the back, I knew Eric Weiss. He was no liar. Another voice joined in. You took my water rights last year, Braddock. Hang him where he stands. Braddock's men nervously raised their rifles. Kohana didn't flinch. Don't, he warned. But Sheriff Clean, seeing his power slipping away, stepped forward, raising his shotgun and pointing it directly at Clara Ara. Clara Ara Weiss, he sneered. You're under arrest for sedition and trespass. You make one more step, Sheriff, Reuben's voice rang out from the other side of the square, and I'll put you down like the dog you are. Guns cocked all around the square, fingers tensed on triggers. Clara Ara stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two armed sides. You want justice? She shouted, her voice echoing off the adobe walls. Then put your guns down and let it happen in the open. Let the marshal come. Let the courts see the truth. We're not hiding anymore. Kohana looked directly at Braddock. End of the line. Braddock's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the pistol tucked inside his coat. Kohana fired first. The shot echoed like a thunderclap. Braddock dropped to his knees, his hand pressed to his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and shocked disbelief. He collapsed into the dust of the town square, dead before he even hit the ground. His men froze. Then, slowly, one by one, they dropped their weapons. Sheriff Clean turned and ran. No one followed him. Later that day, the marshal finally arrived, far too late to stop the bloodshed, but just in time to clean up what was left. The townspeople untied the prisoners. Dr. Llewellyn gave his official testimony. The documents were taken into federal custody. Clara Ara's name was cleared, but something inside her still didn't feel settled. She sat alone on the edge of the square that night, watching the first stars blink into existence in the vast, dark sky. Kohana came and sat beside her, silent. You think this changes anything? She asked quietly. For some, he said. Not for you? He shook his head. The land is still bleeding, but maybe now it has a chance to heal. She looked at him. What about you? What will you do now? He turned his gaze to the far horizon. Take the boy home. Start there. She nodded. Tell him his uncle fought like a warrior. Kohana's voice was low when he replied. And I'll tell him you did too. The wind rose again, but this time it didn't bring the smell of smoke. It just carried the clean scent of dust, sage, and the faint, fragile promise of something new. You didn't just survive this, Clara Ara, she thought to herself. You put it on the record for everyone to see. Weeks passed. The desert, as it always did, kept its own counsel. It didn't mourn the dead. It didn't rejoice for the living. It simply endured. But people could change. Clara Ara stood beneath the arching, twisted limbs of an ancient juniper tree, at the very edge of Mesa de las Estrellas, her father's worn journal open in her hands. The air was clean and thin up here, high and wide, a place where the stars came out brighter than anywhere else on Earth, just like he used to say. Below her, in the valley, the survey crew from Santa Fe moved with a quiet, methodical purpose, measuring, mapping, drilling. Their work was honest. They weren't here for power or for greed. They were here for water, for the truth of the land. And now, that water would belong to the people. Behind her, Reuben approached, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Paper from back east says they're calling it the Weiss Aquifer," he said with a rare half-smile. "Not a bad legacy to leave behind." Clara Ara folded the journal and tucked it safely into her satchel. It was never about the name. He just wanted the land to be able to live again. Reuben nodded. "Well, it will." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the vast horizon seem to breathe in the fading light of day. "Marshall says the trials will begin in the fall," he added. "Clean's already turned on the rest of Braddock's men. The whole damn deck of liars is coming down." "Let it fall," Clara Ara said. "Let something better rise up in its place." Reuben looked at her, a question in his eyes. "You going back to Red Hollow?" She shook her head. "It's not my home anymore. That land was bought with silence and bled dry by greed. I'll sell it to the town. Let them make something good of it. A school, maybe, or a shelter for those who need it." Reuben grinned. "Your father would have liked that." "He'd have liked you too," she said quietly. "Even after everything." Reuben looked away, a faint blush of embarrassment on his weathered cheeks. "I only ever told half the truth, Clara Ara. But you made it whole." She gave him a small, grateful smile. A few days later, Clara Ara rode north with Kohana and Taji. The boy was nestled securely between them on horseback as the sun dipped low behind the distant mountains. They traveled in a quiet companionship, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of something that had been broken and was now slowly, carefully, being mended. They stopped for camp that night beneath a rocky outcrop of stone. Taji watched the firelight dance while Kohana carved something small and intricate from a scrap of juniper wood he'd picked up along the trail. When he was finished, he handed the carving to the boy. It was a bear, crouched and strong. "For protection," Kohana said. Taji held it carefully in his small palm. Will I ever see you again?" he asked, his eyes turning to Clara Ara. Kohana looked at her. "That's not my call to make." Clara Ara knelt beside the boy, her heart aching. "You'll write to me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Every full moon. That's our deal." He nodded solemnly, then leaned into her, resting his head against her chest. She held him there for a long time, until the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the coyotes began to sing their lonely song in the distance. Later that night, as Kohana was packing the saddle for an early morning start, Clara Ara walked to the edge of the clearing and looked up at the brilliant tapestry of stars. "What will you do now?" she asked, not looking at him. "Go home," Kohana said. "My people still need voices to speak for them. And now that mine isn't being hunted, maybe it can finally be useful." She nodded slowly. "You're not just a warrior, Kohana. You're a witness." He looked at her then, his expression serious. "So are you." When they finally reached the reservation, Clara Ara watched as the children came running to greet them. Taji jumped down from the horse and ran into the arms of his aunt, who held him so tight it looked as if she feared he might vanish into thin air. The other children circled him, laughing, curious, full of life. Alive. Clara Ara didn't follow. She stayed at the edge of the settlement, one hand resting on the reins of her horse, her heart full. Kohana walked back to her. "You could stay," he said. Clara Ara smiled, a real, genuine smile. "No, this was your path. I have to find mine again." He held out his hand. She took it. "No one writes stories about women like you," he said. "They only ever write about the men they ride behind." "Then maybe it's time I start writing it myself." Months later, Clara Ara sat in the back of a small, crowded town courthouse in Santa Fe. She watched as former deputies were sentenced and Braddock's once vast empire was picked apart piece by piece. The journal, her father's legacy, was now in the hands of archivists. The water rights were protected under federal law, and the name Vice no longer meant scandal or traitor. It meant justice. When she walked outside into the bright sunlight, a young reporter chased after her. "Miss Weiss, can we get a statement?" She paused and turned. "Justice," she said, "isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like a boy being tucked safely into bed, or a town getting its first clean well, or a lie finally being corrected after far too long. But when it finally comes, it echoes." Back at Mesa de las Estrellas, the wind still whispered across the ancient stones. And in that whisper, if you listened close enough, you could still hear a father's promise, carried on the air. "Let the truth outlive me. Let it run like water. Let it save someone." Because in the end, the West was never won by guns. It was reclaimed by those brave enough to speak the truth and to stay and fight for it. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the strange, dark, and mysterious.